Hello everybody, thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we're going to be taking a look at the discography of Buffalo Springfield. Buffalo Springfield is a group that was not together for a very long period of time. They only made 3 studio albums during their short time together, but it is undeniable that they were a hugely influential group to a variety of different musicians, and more importantly, it is some of the earliest music that we would hear from multiple songwriters that would go on to have incredible careers with Neil Young, Stephen Stills, and Richie Furay, and all 3 of them contribute some exceptional songs throughout this 3-album discography of the Buffalo Springfield, and it is a discography that I think is well worth exploring. So what I'm going to do today is go through their 3 studio albums, starting with Buffalo Springfield and going up to Last Time Around, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 3 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut self-titled album from 1966 titled Buffalo Springfield, and I will give this an A. I think this is a very strong debut record, a great introduction to their sound, and it offers a nice selection of tracks that showcases their different stylistic sensibilities in a very effective way. We get this interesting combination of folk rock, pop rock, and country rock on certain tracks, with songwriting split up between Stephen Stills and Neil Young, with no songs by Richie Furay at this point, and that is one thing that I do think is missing from this record, because Richie would go on to write some seriously amazing tracks on the next 2 records. This album is 12 tracks long, and I would say about 85% of this album is great. It's got a couple of tracks here and there that I'm not crazy about, but I do think the majority of this album is excellent. I think Neil Young in particular has some really exceptional tracks on here, and it's so cool to hear how mature and confident his sense of songwriting already was at this early stage of his career, with tracks like Nowadays Clancy Can't Even Sing, Flying on the Ground Is Wrong, and Do I Have to Come Right Out and Say It? Stephen Stills also contributes some great stuff that balances out Neil's sensibilities really nicely, with the obvious classic hit For What It's Worth, which is in my opinion one of the best songs that Stephen Stills wrote for the Buffalo Springfield, and the track that they are probably most well known for. In addition to that, some other standout Stephen Stills tracks for me are Go and Say Goodbye and the closing track, Pay the Price. And while this album has a lot of stuff that I love about it and plenty of amazing tracks, it does have a couple of songs that I don't find particularly exciting and would regard as skip-overs, with the songs Hot Dusty Roads, Burned, and Leave. To me, those 3 songs sound a little more generic and don't contain the same unique elements that a lot of these other songs do, and to me that's something that made Buffalo Springfield such a different band for their time, and I just find that those 3 tracks fall a little bit flat. But regardless of that, there are still some amazing tracks on here. My favorite song on here would have to be Nowadays Clancy Can't Even Sing. I think that is a masterpiece from Neil Young. And for Stephen Stills, I would have to go with For What It's Worth, but I do think that their songwriting will get even better on future releases, and I think the addition of Richie Furay writing some songs also makes the future albums a little bit more enhanced in comparison to this one. But regardless of those few minor critiques, this is still a very strong debut album, so I will give this one an A. Okay, next we have their second studio album from 1967 titled Buffalo Springfield Again, and I will give this an S. I think this is an incredible album and a further improvement from the previous release. I think this record is more consistent from front to back. The quality of the songwriting is more enhanced, and the production is significantly better as well. On this record, the songwriting is now being split between Neil Young, Stephen Stills, and Richie Furay, and I think Richie's compositions proved to be a very positive addition to this group and this album. We have 3 songs from Richie Furay, 3 songs from Neil Young, and 4 from Stephen Stills, and stylistically we get this interesting blend of folk rock, hard rock, psychedelic, and some country and bluegrass elements on select tracks. Neil Young contributes 2 originals on side 1 with Mr. Soul and Expecting to Fly. Mr. Soul brings things in with a great energy and showcases more of that hard rock side of Neil's writing. And then Expecting to Fly is a very beautiful artsy orchestral track, and this would go down as my favorite Buffalo Springfield song. I think this song is so beautiful and so adventurous, and in my opinion is Neil Young operating at the top of his game. Richie Furay also contributes 1 song on side 1, which is an acoustic folk and country track titled A Child's Claim to Fame. This is a beautiful song and a great introduction to the songwriting of Richie Furay. And then Stephen Stills gives us 2 tracks titled Every Days and Bluebird. I love the vibe of Every Days. It's chill, but also has these rich psychedelic layers all over it. And I've always loved when you hear the psychedelic side of Stephen Stills on the couple of times that he gives us tracks like that in the Buffalo Springfield discography. And his other original, Bluebird, goes into more of that hard rock direction and is in a similar vein to the opening track of the album, Mr. Soul. So for side 1, I think they did a really great job of giving us a little bit of everything they have to offer between the hard rock elements of Mr. Soul and Bluebird, the folk and country elements on A Child's Claim to Fame, and the psychedelic and artsy elements on Every Days and Expecting to Fly. After that, side 2 delivers another amazing 5 songs, with 2 written by Stephen Stills titled Hung Upside Down and Rock and Roll Woman. I particularly love Rock and Roll Woman. I think that's the best Stephen Stills song from this album and might actually be my favorite song of his of the entire Buffalo Springfield discography. It's such a pretty and moody track with a nice energy to it and really lush vocal harmonies that to me are a very clear precursor to Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. Richie Furay also contributes 2 more tracks titled Sad Memory and Good Time Boy. Sad Memory is a very beautiful acoustic, folky track with pretty vocal melodies and chord movements that give me flavors of Paul Simon, and this would be my favorite Richie Furay track from this record. And then his other track, Good Time Boy, takes a complete stylistic detour into more of a groovy and soul sort of territory, with lead vocals being done by Dewey Martin. I don't think this is a bad song, but if I had to pick a least favorite track from this album, I would go with this one. The album concludes with the only Neil Young composition on side 2 titled Broken Arrow. Again, another very artsy Neil Young song with lots of changes and varying instrumentations, and another great example of the very interesting stuff that Neil was writing in the early part of his career. And I think it's a great closing track to a very consistent album with some very standout individual tracks from each member, and I think they did a great job of contributing their own unique songs in a way that worked very well on their own, but also worked very well together and resulted in a very fun and dynamic album that is very consistent from front to back, with improved songwriting and significantly improved production. So an amazing record. This one gets an S. Okay, and lastly, we have their third and final studio album from 1968 titled Last Time Around, and I will give this an A. I think this is another great album, but I don't think it's as strong as the previous release, but I do think it is better than their first record, so I would rank this as number 2 in their discography. There were some changes in the group leading up to the making of this album. Jim Messina comes into the picture and replaces Bruce Palmer as the bassist, and as far as the songwriting goes, Neil Young contributes a few tracks and Jim Messina would write one song, but the majority of the songwriting on here is being done by Stephen Stills and Richie Furay, and in my opinion, Richie Furay really shines the brightest on this album. Compositionally, he really stretches out and in my opinion produces a couple of the best songs that he's written for the Buffalo Springfield. As far as the Stephen Stills tracks go, there are a couple that I really love, but there's like 1 or 2 that I wouldn't say are his strongest contributions to Buffalo Springfield. And because of that, and because of the fact that I wish Neil Young had written a couple of more tracks for this record, those are my 2 main reasons for putting this in A tier as opposed to S. Side 1 gives us 6 tracks, with 1 by Neil Young, 1 by Neil Young and Richie Furay, 3 by Stephen Stills, and then 1 by Jim Messina. Both songs that Neil Young are on, I think, are absolutely incredible, with the opener On the Way Home, which is a very nice pop rock track with a great energy to it, and I love the instrumental horn melody that happen in between sections. Probably my favorite song from this album. Then we have this very moody acoustic folky track by Richie Furay and Neil Young titled It's So Hard to Wait. And very similar to the previous album, it contrasts the energetic opening track beautifully and gives us a nice little change in pace. I love the horn parts that come in later on in this song. Very nice instrumental textures. As far as the Stephen Stills tracks go, I really enjoy Pretty Girl Why. This one has some very cool psychedelic elements to it and would be my favorite Stephen Stills track from this record. And I think his other 2 songs titled 4 Days Gone and Special Care are both fine songs, but I don't think they stand out as much as the first 3 tracks of this album. And Jim Messina contributes a country track titled Carefree Country Day, and this is another song that I think is okay, but I wouldn't say it's a standout track from this record. And in general, I just think the opening 3 songs of side 1 are pretty much perfect, and then the second half I would say is still good, but I don't think it reaches the same highs that the first half of side 1 does. Side 2 then gives us 3 more Richie Furay tracks, as well as 2 Stephen Stills songs and 1 more Neil Young track. And as far as this side goes, I think Richie Furay really steals the show. All 3 of his songs are very different from one another and are all so unique and executed so effectively, and just really showcase how versatile he is as a songwriter. He starts out side 2 with The Hour of Not Quite Rain, which is another very deep and artsy orchestral track with a beautiful string section and so many beautiful vocal melodies and textures. The perfect way to open up side 2, and probably my favorite Richie Furay song of the Buffalo Springfield discography. For side 2, he also wrote Merry-Go-Round, which is a really sweet pop song with some nice psychedelic qualities to it. Another cool side to Richie Furay that we hadn't really heard yet. And then the album concludes with another amazing Richie Furay track titled Kind Woman. This is a beautiful country ballad with amazing pedal steel guitar fills and just a super sweet and feel-good track to conclude the album on. For the Stephen Stills tracks, I think Questions is a great song, but Uno Mundo is a pretty underwhelming song in my opinion. This might be my least favorite Buffalo Springfield song. I would have been fine if they just let this track off of the album. And for Neil Young, we only have 1 song on side 2 titled I Am a Child, and this is a great track that's more on the acoustic folky side of things, and is a song that does sound more similar to something that he would write for his future solo albums. It's a beautiful track, and again, like I said, I just really wish Neil had contributed a couple of more songs on this record, because I think his compositional style really balances everything out so nicely and always adds some nice contrast. So similar to the first album, I would say about 85% of this record is fabulous and showcases some of the strongest tracks of Richie Furay and shows the further evolution of each songwriter and concludes their studio discography on a very strong note, with some of the songs on here being the best songs that they have written up to this point. But I still do think Buffalo Springfield again is stronger and would be their best record, but this one comes in at second place. So a great final album. This one gets an S. Alright, so those are my takes on their 3 studio albums. This is a pretty easy discography to go through, so for anybody who hasn't checked out these records, I think they are well worth exploring and showcase some amazing songs from the early stages of 3 pivotal songwriters who would go on to be hugely influential. And this group is a great example of how each of them were wise beyond their years when it came to their songwriting and wrote some very sophisticated music and made albums that will forever be considered timeless records to come out of the decade of the 60s. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was enjoyable. And if you are interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists linked in the comments and the description and see if there's anything else that you might like. And like I said, please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 3 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. All right, that is it for today. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.